Chapter 1. The village of Westring Vale had the sort of beauty that dulled one's suspicions. Sloping gardens with clipped hedges, rain-slicked cobblestones that gleamed under the morning mist, and neighbours who nodded with warm civility, whether they liked you or not. It was late October, and the leaves had begun to fall in papery spirals, carpeting the lane between the churchyard and the vicarage in fading gold. Inside the vicarage drawing-room, tea was being poured with the usual fuss and flourish. The occasion, a modest afternoon gathering in support of the Church Roof Fund, organised by the Reverend Julian Merrow's wife Clara, whose obsession with acceptable morality and biscuit presentation often took precedence over the scripture itself. The room smelled faintly of cardamom buns and silver polish. Conversation rippled in corners, a gentle background hum. Among the guests were Mrs. Nora Winchell, who never missed an opportunity to mention her late husband's connections to Parliament. Mr. Felix Dearden, the somewhat pompous pharmacist, with a weakness for his own voice, and of course Miss Jane Marple, quietly seated by the window with her embroidery. But it wasn't any of them who drew attention that day. The woman arrived precisely at 3:41 p.m., just after the second round of ginger cake. She came on foot, her steps hesitant yet determined. Her clothes were modest but neat, except for a peculiar shawl, frayed at the edges, a once vibrant maroon now dulled to muddy plum. Her gloved hands clutched the shawl tight around her thin shoulders, and she blinked at the vicarage door as though unsure it were real. "May I help you?" Clara Merrow asked, already on her feet, porcelain smile in place. Yes. I was told there'd be a gathering. I'm new here, lodging at Briar Cottage," the woman said. Her voice was soft but rough around the edges, the way a song might sound after too many years unsung. Clara hesitated, just long enough to register that this woman did not belong, then ushered her in with polished charity. "Of course, do come in. We're always delighted to meet new faces." Miss Marple, her embroidery paused mid-stitch, observed silently, not out of impoliteness, but with the clinical attention one gives to a hairline crack in a teacup that everyone else seems determined to ignore. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Edith Lonsdale, recently widowed, recently arrived, and not entirely comfortable speaking of either. Her eyes flicked about the room with a hunted animal's caution, then landed on the tea tray, as though it offered some neutral ground. The others received her with a practised warmth, but beneath the polite questions and polite laughter, something else stirred. "How very sad," cooed Mrs. Winchell. "Not sad at all. It must be such an adjustment, losing your husband and changing residence in one go. I hope you're not finding it too lonely." "I like the quiet," Edith replied, then added too quickly, "The peace is what I came for." Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime decoding the buried meanings in such casual remarks, noted the almost imperceptible tremble in the woman's hands as she reached for her teacup. Later, as conversation meandered to rose pruning and the scarcity of good linen, Edith Lonsdale's attention remained fixed, oddly, on the framed portrait above the fireplace. Reverend Merrow's father, painted in funereal oils, his eyes stern even in oil and canvas. Miss Marple looked up just as the woman lowered her gaze. She had not blinked in nearly 20 seconds. By the time the gathering wound down, the guests had politely catalogued Edith as a bit odd, but harmless. As the last crumbs of cake were swept away and shawls collected, no one spoke of her directly. Not even Miss Marple, who merely said to Clara, as they collected cups, "A very unusual piece of fabric, that shawl she wore. Turkish weave, if I'm not mistaken. One hardly sees that outside of certain places." Clara blinked. "You noticed it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One does notice such things when one has spent enough time knitting next to a fire." Outside, twilight settled over Westring Vale with chilly fingers. Edith Lonsdale walked, back alone, to Briar Cottage. A blackbird startled from the hedge as she passed, but she did not flinch. Miss Marple watched from the window a moment longer, then returned to her embroidery. The thread she chose was red. "Before moving next, detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments, and if you crave more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file is even darker. Stay sharp." Chapter 2. Briar Cottage had once belonged to a stonemason's widow, and still bore the stubborn marks of its history. Weather-worn shutters, slate roof patched in mismatched pieces, and a chimney that leaned slightly like a man who'd grown tired of standing upright. It sat at the edge of the village, past the greengrocer's and the old livery yard, with a single footpath leading into the woods behind. Edith Lonsdale moved through the house as if afraid to wake something. The furniture, inherited from the former tenant, was sturdy but joyless. Oak chairs with stiff backs, a narrow bed with creaking joints, and curtains in a pattern of roses that had long faded to grey. She touched nothing she didn't need to. That night she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of barely touched tea. The fire had gone out, and the only sound was the clock ticking above the sink. On the table lay an envelope worn at the corners, the seal broken. Inside was a letter, or part of one. She didn't reread it. She didn't need to. Instead, she folded it carefully, tucked it beneath the lining of a biscuit tin, and slid the tin back into the cupboard behind a row of jars labeled lentils, thyme, and pearl barley. Then she turned out the light and climbed the stairs without looking back. The following morning in Westring Vale arrived with a chill that clung to the hedgerows. At the post office, adjusting his scarf as though to brace himself for further oddities, kept looking at that blasted portrait as though it had spoken to her. "Well, she did lose her husband quite recently," Clara Merrow said diplomatically. "Grief wears people in different ways." "She's not from here," Mrs. Winchell declared, as if that were damning enough. From behind a rack of birthday cards, Miss Marple listened with the appearance of complete distraction, carefully selecting a card with an embroidered bird on it. "Funny, isn't it?" she said mildly to no one in particular. "How newcomers always seem to stir the dust in a village, even when they tread ever so lightly." At the edge of the green, Constable Hensley stood beside his bicycle, watching Edith from a distance as she left the grocer's with a paper bag clutched close. She didn't notice him, or perhaps pretended not to. When she crossed toward the path leading to Briar Cottage, she paused, hesitated, and then glanced over her shoulder. No one was following her. And yet she did not take the path. Instead, she continued down the lane, her footsteps too quick, her eyes scanning the hedgerows as though expecting something to set out of them. From an upstairs window of the vicarage, Miss Marple watched the same scene. She had seen that same walk in a young woman once, years ago, in another village, after a man's suicide, was quietly determined to be something else. It was the walk of someone waiting to be caught, not out of guilt, but out of inevitability. She turned from the window and returned to her writing desk. Her niece had sent her a new sort of crossword puzzle, one with diagrams and cryptic instructions. She took no pleasure in it today. That evening brought a low fog that settled in pockets. Across the green, at the Three Magpies, the village pub, conversation grew louder than usual as the damp air pressed against the windows. Edith Lonsdale arrived just after 6:30, surprising everyone. She ordered a ginger beer and took a seat in the corner, barely lit by the overhead lamp. She didn't speak to anyone unless addressed, but eyes followed her all the same. When Miss Marple entered, invited by a visiting cousin of the vicar's wife, a talkative woman with a taste for lamb pie, she made her way slowly across the pub and offered Edith a gentle nod. The woman looked up, startled. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" "It is," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, "and you must be settling in well if you found the Three Magpies. Most don't come here until at least their third Sunday." Edith's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. "I wasn't sure if I should come." "That's usually the best reason to do so," Miss Marple replied. "One meets such interesting people when unsure of oneself, and one sees even more." There was a silence, not uncomfortable, but loaded with something unspoken. "I'm not used to villages," Edith murmured. "Everyone seems to know each other's stories." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled gently. "They know parts of stories, my dear, and some prefer it that way." Just then Mr. Dearden passed their table, nearly tripping over the edge of a worn rug. He recovered, flushed, and muttered a quick apology before vanishing into the back. Miss Marple said nothing, but Edith's eyes lingered on the pharmacist's retreating back with something close to fear. That night, as the pub emptied, the fog outside grew thick enough to swallow the road beyond the gate. And when Edith stepped out, she found the lane deserted. She turned toward Briar Cottage, the sound of her steps muffled in the mist. She didn't hear the second set of footsteps until she reached the edge of the woods. They stopped when she stopped. They moved when she moved. Chapter 3. Edith Lonsdale did not look back. She tightened the shawl around her shoulders and walked faster, her boots crunching along the narrow path that curved between the trees behind Briar Cottage. The fog thickened, curling low over the moss-covered ground like smoke. Whoever followed her, if someone was indeed following her, kept a careful distance. The rhythm of their steps matched hers at first, then faltered, as though hesitant to close the space. It was not the tread of someone confident, she thought, nor the heavy footfall of a man used to confrontation. It was careful, cautious, watching. When she reached her back gate, she paused. Her hand trembled on the latch. Silence pressed around her like a held breath. Then, in one sudden movement, she swung the gate open and stepped through, slamming it shut behind her with more force than necessary. The noise echoed briefly, then vanished into the fog. Inside, she bolted the door, closed the curtains, and stood in the kitchen a long while, listening to the wind move faintly along the eaves. The next morning brought a brittle cold that made the frost on the grass glitter like powdered glass. Miss Marple rose early and took her customary walk to the greengrocer's, where the parsnips looked over-handled and the conversation over-ripe. "Strange weather last night," muttered old Mr. Cresswell, puffing on a pipe he never lit. "Fog came in fast, like it had somewhere to be, or someone to follow," Miss Marple murmured. He blinked at her. "Beg pardon?" She smiled. "Only a turn of phrase, Mr. Cresswell. Though fog does seem to have a mind of its own, doesn't it?" As she paid for her apples, she overheard Clara Merrow chatting with Mrs. Winchell by the window display of tinned peaches. "She was out late again," Clara whispered, with mild disapproval. "The new woman, Edith. Reggie saw her coming from the pub after 7, alone." Mrs. Winchell raised an eyebrow. "That one's no stranger to shadows, I'd wager. I've seen her look over her shoulder more times than a thief with unpaid debts." Clara sighed. "Perhaps she's just shy. Or perhaps," Mrs. Winchell said, lowering her voice, "she has something to hide." Miss Marple quietly selected a jar of cloves. "People often do," she said, not looking up. Later that day the Reverend Merrow stopped Miss Marple outside the church gates, only that it wasn't the wind. She wouldn't elaborate, but she looked pale, worn. Miss Marple nodded. "Fear does that, I find, especially when it's old fear resurfaced." The Reverend frowned. "Do you think she's in danger?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "she believes she might be." At Briar Cottage, Edith had drawn every curtain. She moved through the house as if it were unfamiliar again. Each floorboard seemed louder, each creak more suspect. She checked the lock on the door 3 times before taking out the biscuit tin from the cupboard once more. The letter still lay inside. She ran her finger along the paper's edge, hesitating. Then, as though steeling herself, she folded it again, but not to return it to hiding. Instead, she placed it in her handbag. That afternoon, she set out on foot toward the High Street. Miss Marple spotted her from the tea-room window of the Rosemary Pot, where she had just finished a quiet lunch with Colonel Appleby and his daughter. She excused herself and stepped outside just in time to see Edith vanish around the corner of the bookshop. She considered following, then decided against it. A bird flies faster when it thinks it's alone. Instead, she walked slowly past the post office, noting that the blinds in Mr. Dearden's dispensary were drawn, odd for midday. As she turned the corner, she almost collided with Constable Hensley. "Miss Marple," he said with a nod, "all quiet today." "For the moment," she said, "though quiet, in my experience, is often the sound just before a secret speaks." The young constable gave her a puzzled smile, unsure whether to treat it as a warning or poetry. By late afternoon, a small group had gathered again at the vicarage for the parish committee meeting. Miss Marple among them. Edith Lonsdale was not present, though she had been expected. "I sent her a written invitation," Clara said, glancing at the empty chair. "Perhaps she forgot." Miss Marple stirred her tea. Or perhaps she remembered something else. Mr. Dearden arrived late, offering no excuse. His collar was damp, as though he'd washed it in a rush. He sat stiffly, answered questions with more sharpness than required, and avoided everyone's gaze, except for one brief moment when Clara mentioned Edith's absence. Then he looked up, quickly, then down again. Miss Marple noticed. That evening, as dusk dipped into full dark, Edith sat alone in her front room, the letter now unfolded in her lap. Her hands trembled slightly. She lit a small fire and watched it catch, flames rising as if hungry for truth. She reached for the telephone. Halfway through dialing, she stopped. Her eyes flicked to the window. Outside, across the garden hedge, a shape moved, a shadow between the trees. It paused, then disappeared. Chapter 4. By morning, the fog had cleared, but left behind a village that seemed more brittle than before, as though something beneath its surface had shifted slightly overnight. The postman, Mr. Linton, delivered his letters with unusual briskness, barely pausing to gossip. Perhaps he'd sensed it too, that change in the wind, quiet but unshakable. At Briar Cottage, the telephone remained untouched, its dial halfway turned from the night before. Edith hadn't finished the call. She had sat beside it until the fire went out, then gone to bed fully clothed, the letters still tucked inside her handbag. She rose early and for once opened the curtains. Morning light spilled in cautiously, revealing dust she hadn't noticed, corners she had left too long untouched. She moved mechanically, tidied the sitting room, boiled water for tea she did not drink, and took the handbag from its place on the chair. Then she changed her mind. Instead of heading toward the post office or church, she walked to the far end of the green, where the old war memorial stood. Behind it, a narrow path led through the willows to a small bench facing the stream. It was a forgotten place, too shaded for most, too quiet for the talkative. Miss Marple, taking her usual stroll through the east lane, saw Edith's figure disappear into the trees. Curious? At the village shop, conversation circled like birds over a newly ploughed field. "She's always out early, that one," muttered Mr. Cresswell. "Walking into hedgerows like she's looking for something she lost." Clara Merrow nodded, more thoughtful than usual. She hasn't returned the vicar's borrowed hymn book, and she was meant to join the garden committee. I don't think she means offence, but she's growing harder to read. Miss Marple entered just in time to hear the last remark. "It's often those who hide the least who become unreadable," she offered gently. "We look for secrets where there are none, and miss the ones wrapped in silence." Mr. Cresswell squinted. "What does that mean exactly?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "That people often carry things we don't expect, especially when they arrive already wounded." By mid-afternoon, Edith returned from the path, hands cold and empty. She had left no letter. She had posted nothing. The decision sat heavily on her face. As she passed the church, she paused. Someone was coming down the path from the bell tower. Mr. Dearden. He didn't notice her at first. His face was pinched red from exertion or something else. He held something beneath his coat, something bulky and wrapped in cloth. When he did look up, their eyes met for the first time in days. He gave a small start, as though seeing a ghost. "Mrs. Lonsdale," he said with a tight nod. "Out for a walk?" She nodded, then glanced down at the bundle beneath his arm. "And you?" Hetty's lips pressed together. "Church maintenance, dust in the tower, bad for the lungs." Of course, their words were ordinary, but the silence between them was not. He moved past her quickly, footsteps sharp on the gravel. Edith stood very still until he had turned the corner. Then she continued home. Slower now, Miss Marple, someone who listens. He ushered her in, surprised but warm. Clara brought tea, though Edith left hers untouched. She sat stiffly on the edge of the chair, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. I came here because it was far, she said softly. Far from him, from everything that happened. You don't have to say anything you're not ready to, the Reverend assured her. But I should, before it happens again. The Reverend leaned forward slightly. Happens again? Dale glanced toward the window. I think I've brought something with me. Not something I meant to carry. But it followed anyway. The words hung in the air like breath in cold air. Before the Reverend could reply, the doorbell rang. Clara answered it. Moments later, she returned, confused. It's for you, Edith. Someone named Mr. Dearden. Edith stood abruptly. Her hands shook. I didn't tell him I was here, she whispered. Miss Marple, passing the vicarage at that very moment with her knitting bag in hand, saw Dearden's figure at the door, his expression unreadable, but his presence oddly strained. Not urgent, not friendly, intent. 5 minutes later, Edith left the vicarage with him. They didn't speak. They walked side by side, stiff as strangers. From her vantage at the hedge, Miss Marple noted how Dearden kept one hand in his coat pocket the entire time. She waited until they vanished down the bend before slipping in to speak with Clara. What did he say to her? Clara frowned. Nothing. He asked if she was in. That was all. But his eyes, they weren't kind. Miss Marple nodded slowly. He's hiding something. Clara blinked. Do you know what? Not yet, Miss Marple said softly, but I believe Edith does. That night, Edith did not return to the Three Magpies. Her lights remained off well into the evening. The curtains never moved, and somewhere, far past the edge of the village, the wind carried the faint sound of something dragging over gravel. Slow, deliberate, muffled. As if someone were removing a burden they'd long waited to let go. Chapter 5. Morning in Westring Vale arrived without colour. A grey veil hung over the cottages and church steeple, muting the dawn into a dull whisper. The birds sang late. Even the dogs barked less. It was the kind of morning where something had changed, and the village hadn't quite caught up to the knowledge yet. By 8 o'clock, word had reached the green. Constable Hensley had been called to the wooded stretch behind Briar Cottage. Something's been dug up, whispered young Timothy Greaves, who had overheard it outside the bakery. Near the stone wall, there's rope and a smell. That last word, smell, spread faster than truth. By 9, Miss Marple was already walking the long way around the stream, her cane tapping lightly against the damp earth. She had heard it too, and while she disliked gossip, she disliked unspoken truths even more. Constable Hensley stood by the wall, looking distinctly pale. 2 uniformed officers from the larger town had arrived, their boots muddy and eyes drawn. They spoke quietly, shielding something behind a canvas sheet hastily thrown over a hollow in the soil. Miss Marple paused several yards away. She did not need to see the thing itself. She had seen enough deaths in her lifetime to read the aftermath. The Reverend Mayor approached beside her, troubled and hesitant. "They found a bundle," he said grimly, "wrapped in fabric, rope too, heavy linen, and bones." Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "Human?" He nodded. "That's what they're saying. The police believe the remains have been there for some time. They're not sure how long. But someone tried to bury it properly, under the roots, like a dog might do with a stolen shoe." She said nothing for a moment, then, "Has anyone seen Edith Lonsdale this morning?" The Reverend blinked. "No, but surely she has nothing to do with this." Miss Marple didn't answer directly. "I believe the answer to that lies not in guilt, Reverend, but in memory." At midday, Clara Merrow arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, looking as though she'd walked through a storm no one else had felt. "She's gone," Clara said, breathless. "Gone? Edith. I went to bring her something warm, a fruit tart, and found her door unlocked. The rooms are untouched, but she's not there. Her handbag is gone, and so is her shawl." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "How long has she been missing?" "Don't know, but she left the kettle full and the fire still smouldering. It couldn't have been more than an hour ago." Miss Marple stood and reached for her coat. "Then we may still be in time." They found her half a mile past the woods, near the disused train line. She wasn't hiding. She sat on an overturned log, her shawl wrapped tight, staring at a gap between the trees, as though it had once spoken to her and might again. Miss Marple approached gently, Clara a few steps behind. "You didn't finish your tart," Miss Marple said, voice low and warm. Edith turned. She looked older than she had even the week before, eyes swollen, lips pale. "I thought I could outrun it," she said softly, "but it came up anyway." "What did, dear?" Edith looked down at her hands. "The body, or rather, what's left of it." Miss Marple sat beside her, cane laid across her knees. "Was it your husband?" A beat, a breath. "No," Edith whispered, "but I think it was someone else's." Later, inside Miss Marple's sitting room, a small fire crackled and tea was poured without ceremony. Clara sat quietly in the corner, occasionally dabbing at her eyes. Edith did not touch her cup, but she no longer seemed like a woman about to run. "There was a man," she said, "years ago, before my marriage, before any of this. He followed me. Not with violence, not at first, but with protect me. I just don't know who." There was a silence, thick with the weight of an old debt unpaid. "Mr. Dearden," Miss Marple said lightly, "seems very invested in your comings and goings." Edith didn't look up. "He was there, back then. He lived near me. He once threatened the man, told him to stay away. I never knew how serious he was. I never asked. And when you came here, he found me again, or I found him. I'm not sure which." Clara glanced up. "You think he's the one who—" Edith's voice was soft. "I think he's been waiting for the past to stay buried, and now that it hasn't—" Miss Marple stood, moving to the hearth. She adjusted the flame with a practised hand. "Secrets," she said, "have very poor manners. They rarely stay quiet when summoned by fear." That evening Constable Hensley returned to the village with a report. The remains had been identified by a damaged ring still on the left hand, a university seal belonging to a man named Giles Renwick, who had disappeared 17 years prior. former schoolteacher, once accused informally of inappropriate attention toward a female student, never charged, simply gone. Miss Marple folded her hands. 17 years was a long time to keep a ghost quiet. But now the ghost had risen, and someone, perhaps more than one person, was growing desperate to silence it again. Chapter 6. The village of Westring Vale adjusted itself as all villages do when death becomes part of the landscape. It clutched its routines tighter. Windows were washed more often, flowers were trimmed with exaggerated precision, and tea was served with more chatter and less reflection. But beneath it all, suspicion festered. The identity of the body, Giles Renwick, spread quickly. So did whispered theories. Those who had never heard of him now claimed to recall his voice, his walk, his fondness for poetry. Mrs. Winchell, in particular, declared that he'd once smiled too long at her niece during a garden fete, and had therefore always struck her as odd. At the Three Magpies, Constable Hensley sat with Miss Marple, a notepad in front of him, a lukewarm cup of tea untouched. We have no solid connection between Renwick and Westring Vale, he said. He never lived here, never worked here, just vanished from Bramley 17 years ago. We checked. No correspondence, no travel records, just gone. And yet, Miss Marple said calmly, his body turns up buried behind a cottage, occupied by a woman he was known to harass. Hensley shifted. That's the thing. She wasn't here when he vanished. She was still in Bramley. No trace she ever came through this village before 2 weeks ago. No official trace, Miss Marple corrected. The constable raised a brow. There are things people do, she continued. Quiet things that don't leave marks in post ledgers or bus timetables. A day trip, a visit to a friend, a warning delivered by someone else. She paused delicately. Or a protector who acted without her knowing. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mr. Dearden's pharmacy. The sign on the door read, "Back in 5 minutes," though the clock inside said otherwise. She waited. 10 minutes passed before he returned, slightly breathless, a dampness on his brow. "Miss Marple," he said with faint irritation, "is there something I can help you with?" "I'm hoping you might help with something curious," she replied. "You see, I've taken an interest in Giles Renwick. A morbid hobby, perhaps. But one must keep the mind active at my age." Knox froze for a half-second. Only a flicker, but enough. "I'm not sure what I could tell you about him," he said, moving behind the counter. "Never met the man?" "No." Miss Marple tilted her head. "That's strange. A young woman arrives in your village, clearly unsettled. A body is discovered behind her house, someone who made her life quite miserable once, and you, who are known to notice everything, especially about new arrivals, remember nothing about how she came to rent Briar Cottage, or why she chose Westring Vale at all." Dearden's jaw tightened. "Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple?" "Not at all," she said sweetly. "I only wonder why you keep looking over your shoulder." She left without buying anything. At the vicarage that evening, Clara and the Reverend hosted a small gathering. It was meant to be a show of village unity. But beneath the clinking of teacups and polite laughter, nerves frayed like worn thread. Edith did not attend. Mrs. Winchell did. "I always said trouble followed outsiders," she declared to anyone who'd listen. "If you ask me, That woman brought more than just a trunk when she came." Clara frowned. "You don't know what she's been through." "Exactly," Winchell said, victorious. "We don't." Across the room, Miss Marple sat beside Colonel Appleby, eyes distant as if calculating something. "She didn't bury him," she murmured. The Colonel said, mishearing. "Edith," Miss Marple said more clearly. "She didn't bury Giles Renwick. Someone else did. Someone who knew how to keep things hidden, and when to unearth them again." That same night, Edith sat in the dark, alone in her cottage. She hadn't lit the fire. The room was cold, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders like armor. She clutched a photograph in her hand, creased, faded, 2 girls in uniform. Arms, linked. One of them her, the other a friend, long gone. The door rattled suddenly. Not a knock, just a pressure, someone testing the latch. She held her breath, then silence, a long, untrustworthy silence. The following morning, Miss Marple requested a copy of the 1907 Westringvale Village Ledger from the church archives. The vicar, puzzled, assisted her without question. She flicked carefully through its brittle pages, fingers moving faster as she neared the end. There it was. G. Renwick, recorded as a guest lecturer during the summer of 1908. A name church ledger confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. Giles Renwick had once passed through Westringvale long before his disappearance. His visit had been brief, just a summer, and buried in memory like a stone beneath ivy. But it was there, and things that are buried, as the village now knew too well, don't always stay that way. She returned home that afternoon, and placed the fragile ledger gently on her side table. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the window latch in short, urgent bursts. She watched it a moment, as if waiting for the house to exhale something forgotten. Then she took out a small black tin from the drawer. Inside were folded notes, observations, names, places. She added a new one. Renwick, summer visitor, 1908, not just Bramley. She paused, then underlined it twice. That evening, Constable Hensley came knocking. "I've been going through the town records again," he said, shivering slightly as Miss Marple let him in, "looking for anything connecting Renwick to this place, and something odd came up." She waited, her hands wrapped around her teacup. There was a complaint filed back in 1909. Barely a note, really. It was recorded as a disturbance during a lecture series. The name Renwick appears, but there's no detail. No one followed it up. Miss Marple nodded, because no one wanted to, or perhaps someone made sure it was left quiet. Hensley hesitated. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that Giles Renwick had a habit of leaving shadows behind him, and someone in this village may have decided 17 years ago that one of those shadows had grown too dark to tolerate." Meanwhile, Edith sat by the cold hearth in Briar Cottage, the photograph in her lap again. Her fingertips traced the edge of her friend's face, the girl whose name she had not spoken aloud in nearly 2 decades. Lena, the girl who had trusted the wrong man, the girl who had vanished after a private conversation with Giles Renwick. No investigation, no outrage, just a resignation that girls who disappear often bring it upon themselves. Edith closed her eyes. What if Lena had come here too, after Renwick left Bramley? What if she had tried to follow him? Not to forgive, but to confront. What if she never left? She rose slowly, set the photo down, and crossed to the dresser where she kept the handbag. Inside, beneath the usual clutter of letters and hairpins, was the folded letter Miss Marple had yet to see. She opened it again. "If anything happens to me, he'll be in Westring Vale. Look for the girl in the shawl. He won't forget her." Lena had written it 17 years ago. She had mailed it the day before she vanished. Edith hadn't opened it until 3 weeks ago, after her husband's death, while sorting old boxes. By then, it had become prophecy. The following morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the village hall. The annual church fete was to be discussed, but Miss Marple had no interest in trifles or tart competitions. She was looking for faces. She scanned the group gathered. Clara Merrow, of course, always punctual. Mrs. Winchell, speaking too loudly. Mr. Dearden, present but uncomfortable. He kept glancing at the doorway, at the windows, as though expecting something, or someone. Miss Marple noted it all. Then, halfway through the meeting, she asked a simple question. "Does anyone remember the summer lectures of 1908? A Mr. Renwick came through then. Quite a forgettable man, I'd assume, but those are the ones who linger." A silence, several blinks. Clara frowned. "I thought he was from Bramley." "He was," Miss Marple said smoothly, "but it appears he was here too." Dearden's teacup rattled against its saucer. He didn't speak. Mrs. Winchell, ever eager to prove knowledge, said, "I believe I remember a poem he read. Awful man, always sniffing around the young girls." Miss Marple nodded. "And who were the girls then, I wonder?" No one replied. The past, it seemed, was no longer safe. Later that day, Constable Hensley returned with something else. A photograph from the Bramley archives. It had been sent at Miss Marple's quiet request. It showed Giles Renwick with a group of schoolchildren. Among them, unmistakably, was Lena, and beside her, barely visible, was a girl who looked just enough like Edith to make one stop breathing for a second. But it wasn't Edith. Miss Marple held the photo to the window. The light struck it just right, revealing a figure in the background. A man, not Renwick, older, standing behind the girls, not touching, but watching Mr. Dearden. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a note. She sent it to Mr. Dearden through young Timothy Greaves, who delivered it with the same dread he reserved for school summons. The note read only, "I believe you tried to protect someone long ago, but protection isn't the same as silence. Shall we talk?" Dearden arrived after sundown. Miss Marple served tea, unhurried. He did not drink. She waited. Then quietly he said, "He was going to hurt her, the second girl, Lena." "I know," Miss Marple replied. "She followed him here. I don't think she meant to kill him, but it happened. I found her crying in the wood, and the burial." He looked down. "I couldn't leave her with it. She ran. I stayed. I did what I had to." Miss Marple was quiet a long moment. Then, "And now?" He looked at her. "Now someone's making it public. But it wasn't me." She raised an eyebrow. "No," he said firmly. "I never touched that grave again." Miss Marple folded her hands. Then someone else had, and the question was why now? Chapter 8. The fog returned to Westring Vale the following morning. clinging low over the fields like breath held too long. It softened the lines of the hedgerows, muted the colours of the cottages, and made even familiar things look slightly wrong. Miss Marple stood from the window and moved to her writing desk, where the photograph still lay in the pool of pale light. She looked again at the background, at Dearden's figure, blurred but recognizable, not threatening, watchful. She took out another note card. Grave uncovered deliberately. Timing too exact to be coincidence. Why now? She underlined now twice, because Giles Renwick had been dead for 17 years. But someone wanted him to be discovered this week. Across the village, Clara Merrow prepared a pot of tea for her husband with trembling hands. The vicar sat reading an article about the remains in the Bramley Herald, brow furrowed. I can't shake the feeling, Clara said quietly, that something's still coming, that this isn't over. Julian looked up. You think Edith's in danger? No, Clara said slowly. I think she was the bait. Meanwhile, Constable Hensley paced the edge of the wood where the remains had been found. The scene was quiet now, the police tape gone. The earth had been recovered. But he saw the difference. The grave had been disturbed from above, not from within. No animal had dug at it. The pattern was too precise. Someone had used a spade. Someone who knew exactly where to dig. Which meant someone who'd known where it was all along. Edith stayed indoors that day. She watched the trees behind Briar Cottage with the intensity of someone waiting for the past to knock twice. She hadn't spoken to Miss Marple since the body had been identified, but something weighed on her now, thicker than fear. A second letter, folded inside the lining of her old case. She hadn't wanted to look at it. It was written in Lena's hand, addressed to her, but never posted. It had come into Edith's possession only after Lena's aunt passed, along with other items sealed in a wooden box marked private. Her hands trembled as she opened it again. If anything happens to me and you're reading this, then maybe I failed. Maybe I let him win. But if you still care, if you still remember what he did, then go back to the village. Someone there knows, someone helped him, and someone else watched. They were older, quiet, polite, but they saw. The phrase hit her like ice. Someone helped him. Renwick had never worked alone. And perhaps, in the shadows of Westering Vale, there was more than one secret buried. At the post office, Miss Marple ran into Clara Merrow, who looked flustered and pale. I've done something foolish, Clara confessed in a whisper. Oh, said Miss Marple gently. I wrote to Lena's surviving cousin. I thought she might know more about what happened. I never told Edith. I didn't want to frighten her, but the cousin wrote back. And she said Lena had sent 2 letters before she vanished. One to Edith and one to someone she trusted. Who? She didn't say. Only that it wasn't family, but that the letter had gone missing. Miss Marple's brow lowered slightly. Or was taken. Clara nodded. It could be anyone. Anyone who lived here then and lives here now. Miss Marple looked toward the green, where villagers were already gathered near the bench, discussing the remains in low, energized voices. Yes, anyone. By late afternoon, Miss Marple requested a meeting with Constable Hensley and asked only one question. Stuart requested the parish records last week. The constable blinked. Before you? Yes, before me. He checked the log. Only one name stood out: Mrs. Nora Winchell. That evening, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Winchell at her ivy-draped cottage just beyond the post office. The older woman greeted her with smug politeness and offered sherry in a cut-glass tumbler. "You must be positively swimming in scandal by now, Miss Marple," she said. "What with the body and the woman and the whole mess. It's dreadful, of course, but rather thrilling." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You must have a sharp memory, Nora, looking into the church records and all." Mrs. Winchell stiffened. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple continued. "I asked Constable Hensley who else had looked into the parish ledger. Seems you were quite interested in names from 1908. Mrs. Winchell gave a short, forced laugh. "Curiosity, that's all. Old faces. I was checking on my uncle's listing." "No uncles named Renwick, surely?" Mrs. Winchell's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" Miss Marple stood slow and deliberate. "That perhaps you remembered more than you let on, and that perhaps you uncovered the grave not out of justice, but revenge." Mrs. Winchell's hand tightened on the tumbler. "My niece," she said, voice low now. "The one I said Renwick smiled at for too long? That wasn't a story. She told me everything, what he tried, what he nearly succeeded in doing. She was 16, and she was never the same after." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Did she come here 17 years ago?" "She followed him," Winchell whispered. "She followed him, just like Lena did. But she didn't find him. He was already gone, already buried, but I never forgot. You found the grave. I watched that cottage every year, just in case. And when I saw Edith move in, with that shawl, just like Lena described in her letter, I knew. I waited until the earth was soft. I dug it up. I wanted people to know what he was, even dead." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And in doing so, you stirred every secret the village had buried with him." Chapter 9. Mrs. Winchell had confessed without calling it a confession. Miss Marple left the ivy-choked cottage with the crisp knowledge of a truth finally unearthed. Not the whole truth, perhaps, but one piece more placed on the board. She didn't blame the woman. Few would. Grief turned inward becomes bitterness. But grief that simmers with injustice, that ferments, it waits. Still, it was not vengeance Miss Marple was most interested in. It was motive, because someone had helped bury Renwick, as ever. But beneath it Miss Marple could see the slow fracture of peace. "I want to leave," Edith said at last, after a long silence by the fire. "I should never have come back." "But you didn't come back to see Westring Vale," Miss Marple said. "You came because of a letter, and that letter asked you to find someone." Edith looked down. Yes, Lena believed someone in this village helped Renwick. Someone more than a witness. Clara inhaled sharply. "But who?" Edith's eyes flicked to the flames. "She said he had allies. Not many, just one or two who admired him. He had a way of drawing people in, convincing them he was misunderstood. Brilliant." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Someone who still thinks of him that way, even now." Clara hesitated. "But who in the village would admire a man like that?" Miss Marple looked into her cup for a long time before answering. "Someone who believes in charm over truth, in reputation over reality, someone who saw in Renwick not a predator, but a fellow gentleman of refinement. The next morning, Miss Marple requested to see the old church archives again. Not the ledger this time, but the lecture schedules and attendance lists from 1908. Julian Merrow fetched them himself, fingers careful over the yellowing pages. "There's little here," he warned. Records were spotty then. Still, the names were there. One in particular stood out, F. Dearden, a teenager then, not yet a pharmacist, but present, listed as assistant to guest lecturer. Miss Marple tapped the name with one gloved finger. He hadn't just known Renwick, he had worked with him. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the pharmacy. Mr. Dearden looked tired, thinner. "You've been watching me, Miss Marple," he said without prompting. "You have questions. I can see it." "I do," she said simply, "because the past rarely stays buried unless someone keeps the earth packed tight." His expression didn't change. "I know you didn't kill Giles Renwick," she said, "but you knew him. You admired him once. Perhaps you believed him. Perhaps you thought the stories about Lena and the others were exaggerated. Hysteria." He stiffened. That man was a genius. His lectures were extraordinary. The girls, they misunderstood his attention. "No, Mr. Dearden," Miss Marple said, soft but firm. "They didn't. You did." He didn't reply, not immediately. Then, lo, "I never touched anyone. I never encouraged him." "But you didn't stop him." He looked at her then, and for a brief moment the mask cracked. Shame, rage, something in between. "I warned him," Dearden whispered. "When Lena came to confront him, I told him to leave, that she wouldn't keep quiet like the others." He laughed, said she'd tire of drama. Miss Marple tilted her head, and then she didn't come back the next day. Renwick looked shaken. He left town that evening. "You thought she'd harmed him?" "I thought he'd harmed her." Miss Marple studied him. "Then why didn't you go to the police?" His voice dropped to a bitter whisper. "Because no one would have believed it. Not with his letters of recommendation, his silver tongue, and my word against his." "And so," she said quietly, "when she was found weeping in the woods, you helped her disappear, Dearden. Looked away. I told her to run, to vanish, and I buried the truth, literally." That evening Miss Marple returned to Briar Cottage. Edith let her in without a word. The fire was lit now. The kettle hummed softly. The photo of Lena had been moved to the mantel. "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "you were meant to be the last witness." Edith looked up. "He followed you once," Miss Martle continued. "But even in death, Renwick's legacy haunted more than just you, his admirers, his protectors, his victims. You all converged in this village. Someone made sure the body was found. Someone else stayed silent too long. And now the past demands closure." Edith's voice shook. "You believe it's over?" Miss Martle's gaze was steady. "Not quite." That night, a new letter arrived at the vicarage. No return address. The handwriting was careful. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Lena, not in Bramley, but seated on a bench just outside the train station in Westering Vale. The timestamp on the back read June 2nd, 1908, the day before she vanished. She had been here. She had always been here. Chapter 10. Miss Marple held the photograph with the care one gives a confession offered too late. The timestamp, June 2nd, 1908, was printed cleanly on the back, just above the embossed mark of a forgotten camera shop in Bramley. But the image spoke more loudly than any date. Lena, seated stiffly on the train station bench, shawl knotted at the throat, eyes hard. There was no smile, no suitcase. Just tension, like a thread pulled taut, and moments from snapping. She had come to Westering Vale, and someone had taken this photograph. The question now was not why Lena had come. It was who had known she was here, and why they kept that knowledge hidden for nearly 2 decades. Miss Marple brought the photograph to Constable Hensley just after dawn, or studied it with quiet unease, thumb brushing the corner of the print. "It proves she was here," he said, "that she wasn't some ghost drifting between villages. She came." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and someone saw her arrive. Likely someone behind that camera." "Could have been anyone," he murmured. "Railway staff, local amateur, photographer." Miss Marple gently shook her head. "No, this photo was posed. She's looking directly at the lens. Got caught unaware, centered. She was waiting for whoever took it. Perhaps even asked them to take it." Hensley hesitated. "But why?" "To prove she was here," Miss Marple said. "To leave behind a marker. Something Renwick couldn't deny if he tried." "I've just spoken with Edith," she said. "She says she remembers a man taking Lena's photo. Said Lena told her she was meeting someone near the station. A friend of Renwick's, not a student." Julian frowned. A friend? From where? She wasn't sure. Only that the man was older, well-dressed, not local. Miss Marple, arriving just behind them with deliberate timing, caught the last few words. "A friend of Renwick's," she said thoughtfully. "Or someone who wanted to become one." That afternoon, Edith brought something to Miss Marple. It was an envelope. Inside, a page torn from a journal. Lena's writing, sharper, less fluid. "He says I misunderstand him, that I let fear twist my memory. But the others won't speak, and his friend did, and he watches always. I think he wants to help me, but I can't trust his silence. There's someone else, a man I've seen twice. A cane, a moustache, gold ring. I think he photographs the girls. I think he knows." Joe Martle's hands stilled. A cane, a moustache, a gold ring, and photographs. The village only had one man who fit that description then, and still did. Colonel Percy Appleby. That evening, Miss Marple paid the Colonel a visit. He greeted her in his usual wool waistcoat, slippers soft against the rug. "Ah, Jane, come to scold me for forgetting the Harvest Fund meeting again." "Not this time," she said, stepping inside. "I came to ask about your camera." The Colonel blinked. "My camera?" "Yes, the one you used quite proudly years ago. Black case, tripod legs that never folded properly." He chuckled. "Good heavens, yes. Had it since '04. Took hundreds of photos, mostly the garden and the village fetes. I was something of a menace." "Did you ever photograph the station?" He hesitated. "Yes, once or twice. Lovely light there at dusk. June of 1908, perhaps." He paused again, the smile faltering. Miss Marple watched carefully. "I may have," he said slowly. "Why do you ask?" She took out the photograph. He flinched, barely. but she saw it. "Lena," she said softly, "you took this, didn't you?" He swallowed. "She asked me to. Said she was meeting someone and needed proof of arrival. I thought it odd, but she looked determined. I developed it for her. Did she return to collect it?" He shook his head. "No, I waited. Days passed. She never came back." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "And you didn't tell anyone?" The Colonel looked away. "What was I to say? That I took a photograph of a young woman the day before she vanished. I didn't know she was gone. I didn't even know her name. But you kept the photograph," she said gently, "all these years." He met her gaze. "I kept it because I feared that I had helped." "You hadn't," Miss Marple replied, "but your silence did." That night, Miss Marple sat at her desk, piecing the timeline together with the final pieces falling gently into place. Lena arrives. She arranges for a photograph to mark her visit. She meets with Renwick. Something happens. A confrontation. A fight. She disappears. Dearden finds her, or finds her after the act. The body is buried. The story sealed until Edith returns. And so does the past. But one thing still clung at the edge of reason. Who sent the photo now? And why? The answer, she realized, lay not with the sender, but the one being sent to. A warning, a message, not for Edith, for whoever had remained silent all these years. Chapter 11. The morning fog had returned like an uninvited guest, curling over the hedgerows and stretching thin fingers across the garden paths. Miss Marple stepped outside with deliberate calm, her walking cane tapping once on the step before she crossed the lane. She wasn't headed to the vicarage. She was going to the Three Magpies. Word had spread that Mrs. Edith Lonsdale would be joining the village ladies that afternoon. Clara Merrow had organized a small charity stitching circle to bring her back into the fold, though everyone in the fold knew it was less about comfort and more about confirmation. Whispers needed watching. Miss Marple planned to watch everything. 2:00. The back room of the pub was filled with the clinking of teacups, rustling embroidery hoops, and the low murmur of women stitching conversation between pleats of silence. Clara sat near Edith, whose shawl, though cleaner now, still bore the faint edges of fray. Mrs. Winchell kept her voice low and her ears sharp. Miss Marple, seated near the hearth, did not stitch. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her eyes wandering, curious but calm. Only once did she speak, just as the conversation reached a lull. "I do think photographs are such strange things," she said softly, yet clearly enough for the room to hear. "You think you're capturing a moment, but really you're holding a threat, one that waits patiently until the right time to be seen." A hush fell. Clara blinked. Mrs. Winchell shifted slightly. Edith's fingers froze over her needle. Only one person spoke, Felix Dearden. He had entered through the back to deliver a medical parcel for Clara's arthritic cousin, and lingered longer than courtesy required. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Only if someone's afraid of being seen." Miss Marple's eyes didn't leave him. "A photograph has no conscience, Mr. Dearden. It only records." "I suppose we all have something we'd rather not have recorded," he replied quickly. 2. Quickly and then he left. Miss Marple watched the door for a moment, then turned to Edith. "He's afraid," she said gently. Edith's reply was so soft it nearly vanished into the clatter of teacups. "So am I." That night, Miss Marple asked Clara for the silence at first. The Colonel tapped his cane once. Dearden looked anywhere but at Edith. Miss Marple let the pause stretch, let the discomfort ripen. Then, without ceremony, she placed the photograph on the table between them. Lena, eyes forward, waiting. "She wanted proof she was here," Miss Marple said, "and she got it." The Colonel exhaled slowly. "Yes, I took it, but I didn't harm her." "No, Miss," Marple said. "But you buried the fact that you had seen her, because you feared being implicated. You feared what she was running toward." Dearden's voice was hoarse. "She wasn't running. She was hunting." Edith flinched. "I found her in the woods," Dearden said, voice cracking. "Not dead, not angry, just broken. She told me what happened, said she'd threatened him, said he'd tried to convince her to keep quiet, that he'd make it all disappear." "And did he?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Dearden whispered. "She killed him, I think. I don't know. She said she hadn't meant to. She didn't even know if he was dead. She ran. I followed, and I buried the body." Miss Marple turned to Edith. "And you never knew the full truth until recently?" Edith nodded once. "She'd only told me she was going. Said if she didn't come back, to remember the shawl, that's all." Miss Marple leaned forward. "So why now, Mr. Dearden? Why was the body uncovered? Who disturbed that grave after all these years?" Silence, then a voice that wasn't his. "I did, the Colonel." All heads turned. "I didn't know it was him," Appleby said, voice dry. "Not at first, but when the news spread, I remembered. I remembered that girl asking me for the photo, how she never came back. I thought maybe he'd done something. Maybe I had helped him lie. I dug to be sure." "Why not say so?" Miss Marple asked. "Because it was cowardice," he said. 17 years of silence doesn't turn into nobility overnight." Miss Marple folded her hands. "So now we know. Lena killed him. Perhaps in fear, perhaps in defense. She fled. Dearden, trying to protect her, buried the truth, literally." The Colonel saw the past coming alive again, and thought to bring the truth to light, though in his own silent way. And Edith was the ghost Renwick had never expected to return. Edith's voice was quiet. "But I didn't come back for him. I came because of her. And in doing so," Miss Marple said, "you let the truth come with you." The meeting ended not with handshakes or closure, but with silence. The kind of silence only truth can bring. Miss Marple remained behind, watching the morning light angle through the tall windows. Not a perfect ending, but a complete one. And in mysteries, that's the rarest thing of all. Chapter 12. The village of Westring Vale did not change overnight. The shops still opened at 9. The church bells still rang twice too loudly. The birds still sang, though even they seemed quieter in the days that followed the gathering in the parish hall. Yet for those who had been there, those 4 seated beneath the arched windows, nothing felt unchanged. Edith stayed indoors. Colonel Appleby cancelled his weekly chess match with Reverend Merrow. Felix Dearden left his pharmacy in the hands of his apprentice and didn't return for 3 days, and Miss Marple, as always, took a walk. She walked past the graveyard and through the wood, where the roots still bore signs of the disturbed earth. The police had long since closed the scene, satisfied that the death, while criminal, belonged to a time they could no longer prosecute. 17 years was a long time. The law's hands grow shorter with each year gone unspoken. Still, truth, once uncovered, has its own kind of justice. She stopped near the clearing. A crow lifted from a low branch, startled. She wasn't alone. Edith stood near the edge of the trees, arms wrapped around herself. Not afraid, not weeping, just standing. "He's still here," Edith said without looking up. "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "He's gone. What remains is yours now, not his." Edith's eyes flicked toward the soil. "Do you believe she meant to kill him?" Miss Marple took her time before answering. "I believe she meant to stop him, and I believe he gave her no choice." Edith nodded once, as if that small confirmation settled something deep. Then she reached into her coat pocket and handed Miss Marple a folded slip of paper. "I found this in Lena's old case after the meeting. It was stuck behind the lining. I hadn't noticed it before." Miss Marple opened it slowly. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "If I disappear, it means I failed. But if you ever find me again, tell them I tried, that I saw what he was, that I was not afraid to say his name." No signature, but none was needed. Miss Marple folded it carefully, and without ceremony placed it in her coat. Back in the village, Clara Merrow sat with her husband at the kitchen table, rereading the local paper's short blurb about the discovery in the woods. No names were mentioned, just remains unearthed, and a possible historical incident now closed. "I suppose that's how most stories end," she said quietly, tucked into vague paragraphs. Julian looked up. "Do you think Miss Marple will be satisfied with that?" Clara considered. Satisfied? Perhaps, but not silenced. Later that day, Colonel Appleby visited Miss Marple's cottage. He looked older than usual, though no less upright. "I've written a letter," he said, "to Lena's cousin. She deserves to know someone else believed her." Miss Marple nodded. "That's a kind thing to do." She may not reply. She may not need to. They sat for unexpected delivery. Package brown paper, no return address. Inside was a photograph album, cloth-bound, fragile. It belonged to Lena. Miss Marple turned each page slowly. There were photos of school friends, garden paths, and train tickets pressed into the margins. But one page had been added recently, the photo of her at the station, below it in Edith's handwriting. She came to speak the truth. The rest of us simply took longer to hear it. 3 days later, Edith packed a single suitcase. She left the shawl behind, folded carefully on the bed. It no longer belonged to her journey. Miss Marple met her at the gate before she could step onto the coach. "No goodbyes?" she asked. Edith smiled faintly. "Only thanks." Miss Marple held out a small parcel, wrapped in cloth, tied with string. "For the train." Edith opened it later. Inside was a notebook, blank, waiting, and a note. "You've lived someone else's story long enough. Write your own. J.M." That evening, Miss Marple walked the lane alone. The sky was beginning to darken. The church bells struck 6. She passed Briar Cottage and paused. The windows were shuttered now. The garden still, but the silence no longer felt haunted. It felt clean, not celebratory, but settled. She turned and continued down the path, the rhythm of her cane steady against the stones. Some stories ended not with answers, but with understanding. And Westering Vale, for all its quiet charm, had finally understood what it meant to see clearly, even when it hurt. Chapter 13. 3 weeks had passed since Edith Lonsdale boarded the early train out of Westering Vale. She left behind no forwarding address, no letters, and no explanations, just an empty cottage and a folded shawl that had once carried the weight of history on its threads. The village, ever resilient, folded itself back into rhythm. At the Three Magpies, gossip returned to more palatable topics. The greengrocer's, questionable parsnips, a wedding rumour involving the farrier's daughter, and a faintly suspicious delivery boy from the next town over who smiled too easily. But even as the talk shifted, something unspoken lingered beneath the everyday. A new kind of silence, not avoidance, respect. The kind of hush that comes after too much noise, when something ugly has been said aloud and can no longer be unsaid. Miss Marple continued her walks. She visited Clara twice weekly for tea, and accepted the Reverend's company when the weather allowed. She said little of the matter that had passed, but that, too, was part of her genius. She had never needed to repeat a solved mystery, only to watch what people became in its wake. One Thursday afternoon, Constable Hensley stopped by with an envelope in hand. "It arrived this morning," he said, tapping it twice. "Postmarked York." Miss Marple set down her sewing and opened it. Inside was a single page. "Thank you. I've started writing. Not her story, mine. I didn't know I had one until now. E.L." Miss Marple folded the letter and tucked it gently between the pages of her gardening almanac. "I'm glad," she said quietly. Hensley hovered. "Will you ever tell the village what really happened? About Renwick? The girl?" She met his eyes. "They know." He blinked. "Do they?" "Not all in words," she said, "but enough to act differently. That's what truth does, when it's been heard, even if not everyone can name it." He nodded, thoughtful, and left. That weekend the Colonel visited again, this time with a calmness about him. "I received a reply," he said, "from Lena's cousin." He nodded. "She thanked me. Said she always suspected something happened, but no one believed the girl had enough strength to stand up to a man like Renwick. I told her. She did." Miss Marple nodded. "It takes a different kind of courage to believe in someone too late and say so anyway." The Colonel, for once, didn't reply. He simply placed his hat in his lap and sat beside her in peace. The parish held a quiet service that Sunday, not for Renwick, nor Lena, nor Edith by name, but for what had passed between them all. Julian Merrow chose a psalm about justice walking slowly, and truth not being swift but certain. No one looked around the room. No one whispered. But when Clara stood after the hymn and spoke, her voice was steady. There are stories we carry that don't belong to us, but we carry them because no one else could. Sometimes laying them down is the hardest part." She didn't cry, and no one asked whom she meant. They knew. Briar Cottage remained empty. The estate agent came once, looked around, and left again without putting up a sign. Somehow, no one asked when it might be rented again. It was as if the walls needed time to breathe, as if the house itself had watched something unfold that required silence to process. One final note arrived from Miss Marple that month, slipped anonymously through her door. It was neither from Edith nor Lena's cousin, but the handwriting was familiar. "You were right. I didn't kill him, but I buried more than a body that night. I buried who I thought I was. Thank you for making me dig it up again. Not for him, for her." F.D. Miss Marple read it twice, then placed it in her desk, beside the photograph of the girl on the station bench. Late one afternoon, Clara joined Miss Marple on the green, where the daffodils had begun to push through the thawing soil. "Do you think Edith will come back?" Clara asked. "No," Miss Marple said simply. "But I think she'll live now, properly. That's more than most ever get." They walked in silence a while, then Clara stopped. "That's something I never asked. Did you ever doubt who had done it?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Oh, yes, often. But the key was never who held the knife or the shovel. It was who stayed quiet while others bled.